The pile walk glitters 'neath the pale blue sky. The little robin has its nest begun, and grass-green linnets round the bushes fly. How mild the spring comes in. The daisy buds lift up their golden blossoms to the sky. How lovely are the pingles and the woods. Here a beetle runs, and there a fly rests on the arum leaf in bottle green. All the spring in this sweet lady, sweet lady, spring in this sweet lady, sweet.
And the countryside not caring, the place names all hazed over with flowering grasses and fields. Their lines.
Welcome to the Working Class Movement Library at Eagle Inn. I'm the library manager and I'm really excited about
For oft when on my couch I lie, in vacant or in pensive mood, they flash upon that inward eye, which is the bliss of solitude, and then my heart with pleasure fills, and dances with the daffodils.
Socialist and communist politics of the 1930s. But we thought it'd be really important and interesting to look at the legacy of the Kinder Scout Mass Trespass.
Two roads diverged in a yellow
today,
wood.
particularly as they
And
face
sorry I could not
emergency.
travel both and be
We've
one
got a brilliant
traveller.
panel to talk
Long
about that
I
tonight.
stood
We've got
and
Anita
looked down
Sethi,
one
Walker
as
and
far as I
Ryder,
could.
Dr. Morgag
where-
Rose from University of Liverpool and the founder of the Loiterers Resistance Movement. I think that's right. We've got Chloe Jefferies from Climate Emergency Manchester and Dave Toft, who is from the Kinder Scout group, Hayfield Kinder Scout group.
Kinder Trespass group.
I'm going to introduce Oliver Lomax in a minute, who is a trustee of the Working Class Movement Library. But before I do that, I just wanted to say a few words about some of the things we've got on display. So we have a banner created by James Fox and Ed Hall. We're hoping to turn it round halfway through the evening so that you can see Ed Hall's contribution to it. So we've commissioned this in partnership with Mid-Pennine Arts to celebrate the 90th anniversary. And there's a little bit of text there from James about what inspired him and what he's produced. We also have some banners on display from a student, Susanna, from Stockport College. There's one just above you there, and there's one in the entrance hall. So she's been inspired by some of the collections at the Working Class Movement Library. So please take your time to have a look at those. And the soundscape that you heard on the way in, that was also produced by James Fox as well. And I would just like to mention that tonight is free. Everything that we do at the library is free. It's free to access, but obviously we welcome donations. It's only because of the support of people like you that the library can keep doing what it does. So I will now hand over to Oliver, who's going to chair tonight's panel.
Hello everybody, I am chair, but as we are limited to space, I'm going to kind of sit down here as it falls upon me to be something of a time fascist and shout at people if they overrun a little bit. We are going to have 2 poems tonight, one that I wrote, but first of all, David Toft is going to, I can try, don't know. There we go, Ronnie Barker, Ronnie Corbett.
Hi, my name's Dave Toft. I was born in Lower Broughton in Salford. My grandparents were born on Chapel Street, actually, so I'm fairly local. Though I haven't been back for some time, and strangely enough, it's changed. One of the things that's changed is that half the rights of way have been blocked off as well when you're trying to drive through, which I know Morgag makes a point about. It's not just a rural issue. Anyway, this is a poem called Climbing Kinder for the 1932 Mass Trespass. It tries to capture the beauty of the moors and why we want to be up there, the struggle for them, and the fact that the greatest danger is complacency. But it isn't overlong either, so it's got some merit in that way as well. To these slopes here on the sides of this great and ancient plateau's edge, where the curlew sings on a summer's day, its solitary swooping note, like a crystal drop of Kinder water, a song far sweeter than any music humans ever made, the walkers came, to claim for all who'd follow the right to hear that song, to breathe that air with smog-bruised lungs, to taste the sweetness of the open space, to pause a moment from the draining race of hard industrial existence. And they called those walkers trespassers, as if by claiming back these stolen treasures, by repossessing all these hard-won pleasures, it was they who were the criminals. But when you climb up Kinder now and feel your legs strain hard against the earth, and fill your lungs with fresh, free air, and watch the long white hair kicking its legs in the very ecstasy of life, remember there are those who would have kept this from us, and those who even now would, if they could, keep us from the silver stream and open moor and wind-swept wood. Thank you.
Thank you, David. That was beautiful. When they said there was going to be another poet, I was very upset, I'll be honest, at first, but that was really moving and very beautiful. It's with great pleasure I now passes over to Julian Batsleer, who, it's been a long time in the making, this event, but he's been the real driving force behind it all. So without further ado, Julian.
Start the whole conversation off. I just want to take us back to the 1930s so we know what was done. Oliver's going to keep you to that 20-minute slot and the PBS live show up there. I am indeed, don't you worry. Okay, can that be seen by everybody? You've got to move that mic in the middle. Okay. There's a lot of walking going on. The 1920s and 1930s was absolutely full of walking and politics. So to get ourselves back into the mood, here's some walking and politics. There's the general strike, plenty of walking and politics there in the aftermath. Oh, it's gone back as that. I've gone to the wrong end. People walking for decent conditions. That's what you did in those days. You know, there weren't Instagram or social networks. You got out there, you collectively walked the streets for decent conditions. You walked for peace and disarmament. And over in India, Gandhi, in 1931, at the Salt March, for Indian independence. And was walking for fascism and against fascism. And you see those little bundle of fascists at the bottom. Well, in 1933, they were up Cheetham Hill Road, and they're going to appear a bit later on when we think what's going on here. So there's quite a lot of political walking going on. And really, what we're talking about this evening and going to be discussing is really all about politics and walking. Closer to home, Eddie Froe, the National Unemployed Workers Movement and the Hunger Marches, Communist Party initiative. And if you look down at the bottom right-hand corner, you'll see the Manchester contingent arriving in December 1932 in Hyde Park with their hammer and sickle banners, and the Lancashire Youth Contingent rising there. And this, as I say, was Eddie Froe, founder of, as Belinda said, founder of the library. And at the, just a bit before that last thing, one of Eddie's great friends, lifelong comrade, Benny Rothman, a young Benny Rothman, was deciding to organise another walk, the Trespass on Kinder Scout. We need to put all this in that sort of context. And we'll be exploring some of that, and I'll be sort of talking through it, because this really was part of the politics of walking, not just sort of going out for a stroll. way I want to sort of approach this really is to make use of a quotation from a woman called Doreen Massey, who was a geographer who died not too long ago. And she had put this really good question about feeling you belong to a place or a landscape in no way entails that it belongs to you. That's not, do you belong to this landscape, but does this landscape belong to you? So the issue of how you belong in the landscape, how you feel in different sorts of landscapes, but also the ownership of the land and the ownership of those landscapes, that sort of belonging is what, if you like, drives most of what we're going to be talking about, and certainly what was part and parcel of the 1930s. To deal with the 1930s, I want to do two things. First of all, I want to talk you through and show a bit about the cultural hinterlands of it all. I mean, the mass trespassers and Benny Rothman and the Communist Party didn't invent all of this stuff in 1930s. It all comes out of quite a long and rich tradition of politics, of land politics, of cultural politics, of nature and the city and the country. So I want to talk you through a bit of that. And then I want to move on, secondly, to look more closely at the mass trespass, at the business of what actually was going on in the 1932 mass trespass. And between us, I'm hoping that these will provide the basis for a discussion which will be based on the bits of paper that were handed out to you when you arrived. So without more ado, I'll try and talk you through that little diagram on the right, the political cultural hinterlands of the mass trespass. And this all starts, in my book, with the diggers. The real historical hinterland of this is the diggers, the original biblical communists, egalitarians in the English Revolution, who went and sort of occupied land they didn't own so they could set up communal settlements. And in a sense, the diggers are the people who set the basic issue of land and common ownership on the political agenda. And you know, and it echoed all the way through from Spence, Marx and Engels, through Alfred Russel Wallace's Land Nationalisation Society, to the socialists, early socialists, through, I should say, to the interwar years. In 1918, I'm sure everyone here knows, have read Clause 4 of the old Labour Party thing. The Labour Party committed itself to the common ownership of the means of production and distribution and exchange. And the Communist Party's bit is underneath that, about nationalisation of all the land. The point to bear in mind about this is that in every single Labour Party manifesto from 1918 through to and including 1945, the nationalisation of land was in those manifestos. What the Labour Party did about it's another matter, but it was there. So the issue of land nationalisation and common ownership is part of the heritage. The other part, sadly, again from that time, is Locke. Locke's view of property. It fell to John Locke, the philosopher of that period, for all sorts of reasons, to invent what became known as Locke's theory of property. He's basically the person who invented the modern notion of private property. He provided a rationale for people to take out of the common treasury bits of their own land and say, that's my land. And in a sense, that then led through the 18th century into the 19th century to being a huge rationale and justification for land ownership and the rights of property. Because as you will see at the very bottom of that little bit of text there, the great and chief end of men uniting into commonwealths and putting themselves under government is the preservation of their property. And it goes through all these folks down to the modern period. The other bit of politics in the hinterland that we ought to sort of take account of is the direct action history. Again, that's got a history going back to the diggers, the Luddites, the Marxists, and the other trespasses that there were in the 19th century, suffrage activism, conscientious objects like Thomas Stevenson, all form different forms of direct action. And again, we will probably later on discuss some of the values and different ideas of direct action that came out. I've lost my place now. Gone. It's clicked where I don't want to be.
Go back.
Oh, it's that one, is it?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's that. Sorry.
Right. Okay. There we are. There's Locke. There's the direct action. There's the bit that I wanted. The bit of direct action which was very relevant, I think, to the Communist Party and the British Workers' Sports Federation, was the workers' control the issues of syndicalism. Lots of complex issues there, but it's worth bearing in mind that those who were involved in organising the trespass were very much involved in that particular strand of direct action politics. Next bit of something to bear in mind, we're now moving towards something which is a bit more cultural about landscape. A big part of the mass trespass was the relationship between urban landscapes and countryside landscapes. The big criticism levelled against the mass trespassers was that they were basically urban louts who did not understand and could not appreciate the countryside. There was this big sense of divide, and I just want to explore that a bit because in different ways it shapes the way in which we discuss it. And just take Blake's Jerusalem as an example. When Blake wrote it in 1804, England was indeed a rural society. By the end of the 19th century, we were indeed at, look at the bottom there, rural society basically disintegrated. We were the most densely urbanized society in the world at that stage. Agriculture and the rural social economy, look, the bottom green lines, were very minimal parts of our society. And one of the fascinating things about what happened at that period is that there was a huge reaction against urbanism and the whole generation of ruralism, forms of, basically, as Raymond Williams put it there, into the 20th century, the relative importance of the working rural economy and the cultural importance of rural ideas was this inverse relationship. What that means for us is that you've got at the end of the 19th century the emergence of countryside preservationist movements. You've got the culture of rambling beginning to emerge out of this ruralism. And importantly, an awful lot of the early socialist thinking was intensely ruralist. People like Ruskin and Carpenter and whatnot really sort of had this strong sense of socialism being a rural phenomenon rather than an urban phenomenon. And so it moves on. And then Herbert Parry, of course, sets Blake to Jerusalem, Blake's poem, to music. Just to point out, by the way, that Parry was a pacifist and didn't really want it to be treated as a great sort of national anthem. So he actually gave the performing rights to the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies. So it started out as a suffrage song, and when those performing rights expired, it passed on to that bastion of rural feminism, the Women's Institute. Ideas of walking about walking. I won't dwell on all of this, but there are whole lots of people who are writing about walking, about the relationship and how one sort of identifies with nature. Rousseau. John Clare is an interesting character there, because John Clare was a lowland rural labourer who had this intense love of nature, but this intense sense of dislocation because he was not able to walk in the countryside. And he got Wordsworth, of course, with all his landscape romanticism. What happened was that rambling became very much part of respectability, self-improvement, rational recreation, and that sort of stuff. And the early rambling organisations all went out of their way to ensure that the working class recognised and tried to sort of have an improving approach to rambling. Walking in the countryside was most definitely not the same thing as walking along the prom or the servile masses arising. The earliest notions of some sort of socialism in walking was at the time through the Clarion movement and Burt Ward and the Sheffield Clarion Ramblers, which I'll again pass over quite quickly. None of all that made any sense or any possibility without access. And so there's a whole variety of organisations that grew up to begin to sort of campaign for access. What is remarkable about the various organisations and the bits of legislation is that none of them really engaged at all with land reform. Most of them dealt entirely with just getting access to land which the owners owned. I need to move on a bit to the 1930s, which I can get through a bit more quickly. The thing at the bottom, I think, is the important point. Never mind the detail. After the First World War, a whole lot of young people began to go into the countryside and discover the countryside. Rambling and hiking became a mass cross-class leisure time activity. And what was very interesting was that for the most part, all the old rambling organisations that emerged at that time simply did not take up the fact that things had changed. And as Thompson points out, that the old rambling movement believed that ramblers should be informed citizens. Most hikers regarded walking as an energetic, companionable leisure activity, not a solemn duty. In terms of the context of the mass trespass, it is important to realise that, as I was saying earlier, the background is the emergence of socialism and the Labour Party and the Communist Party. And just to sort of point out that that bottom bit about class against class is actually quite important. It's very arcane, it's very weird internal Communist Party history, but actually it was what was part and parcel of what drove people like Benny Rothman and Eddie Froe at that time. It was a much more upfront, working class sort of approach to socialism. And that became quite important when it moved into the British Workers' Sports Federation. as probably most people know, the British Workers' Sports Federation was the body which formally organised mass trespass. What people sort of ignored and never really acknowledged since was that from 1928 onwards, the British Workers' Sports Federation was effectively controlled by the Young Communist League, which was part of the Communist Party. And they changed the constitution of the British Workers' Sports Federation, as it says at the bottom there, to support sportsmen and sportswomen in an unrelenting struggle against the existing capitalist domination of sport and the introduction of a socialistic content into sport and physical recreation. Yeah. It is worth bearing it in mind. I mean, it sounds weird, it sounds outdated, one couldn't make those sorts of cases now, but one has to acknowledge that this was the political milieu out of which the mass trespass emerged. And so this is where Benny Rothman emerges, and his way of introducing a socialist content to the sport of rambling is to invite people out for the best day out you have ever had, which is what he called the mass trespass. There you are. There's the working class walkers, hikers, who are having the best day out they ever had. It's better than going to Blackpool. It's better than anything like that. It's a really good day out. And just to note what they actually thought they were doing, what they were for and against. They were against the moorlands being closed, fine, but they were for cheap fares, cheap catering facilities, against any war preparations in rambling organisations, and importantly, against petty restrictions such as singing, etc. And so they invented and sang their own song. And this is probably one of the few things which might be new to most people tonight. Everyone knows the Manchester Rambler. What they actually sang was that. It sang, as they were going up and down there, "We are young workers who in search of healthy sport leave Manchester each weekend for a hike." Now, the poets here, if you were actually to deconstruct those first two lines, you'd realise why they got the backs up of the entire rambling community, the entire outdoor movement, because they assert they are young. All those who were imprisoned as a result of the mass trespass were under 23. They were workers, they were proud workers from around here. You know, they were urban workers. They weren't sort of ruralists in that sense. In search of healthy sport, dearie me, that's a bit off. Rambling is a noble cause, it's not a sport. Leave Manchester, God, urban place, what do they know about the countryside in Manchester? You know, each weekend for a hike. Now, the Manchester Ramblers Federation banned the use of the word hike because it's a nasty Americanism. It's not the right sort of thing for walkers, is hiking. So there you go. So that's what they sang. And the reactions were that it was called the mob law on the moors, that it was a hooligan element. And Lock and the Diggers played itself out in the courts. And Benny Rothman and others, whole apparatus of the state was brought to bear, and prison sentences were given out. Worth looking at, just noting before I finish here, that Phil Barnes, it's a quote from Phil Barnes, who was an active member of the Council for the Protection of Rural England and was well known as a trespasser on Kinder Scout long before this. People were trespassing on Kinder Scout as individuals well, from 1900 onwards, if not earlier. And it's interesting to note his reaction to it, that he cared so much for Kinder etc., etc. But frankly, I would rather stay away from the hills myself and leave them to the tender mercies of the shooter and the keeper than see the delicate beauty of these clusts vulgarised by picnic parties, as for instance the Conchtry Bridge end of Lathkill and the Thorpe end of Dover today. So what they didn't object to trespassing, it was the mass bit that they didn't like. The real sort of political cutting edge of the mass trespass is opening up the possibility of mass mass action. And what's interesting is that there was one other mass trespass afterwards at Abbeybrooke off Sheffield. The British Workers' Sports Federation didn't appear again. They had other things to do. If you're a member of the Communist Party in 1932, actually going up Kinder Scout every weekend on a trespass is not your priority. The British Union of Fascists are on the streets of Cheetham Hill. They need stopping. You need to unionise workers in Manchester, fascism in Spain. So in a sense, it was a bit of a one-off. It faded from memory, but it was always there in some ways. And it left the question, and it's one which really feeds us forward, the changes that were taking place in the countryside, the changes in attitudes to walking. Across the country, agriculture was in decline, and clearly the question that is beginning to emerge politically, much broader than is what's the countryside for? It really does become a huge issue at that stage, and more or less over here, it seems to me, and I'll perhaps come back at this in later discussions, but it seems to me that what was so interesting about the mass trespass was it had this huge choreography about it. It had this huge mythic element. It had an extraordinary resonance because it touched so many different issues. It was not just a one-off event. It was something which brought together lots of complicated change in relation to outdoor activities, in relation to the countryside, and crucially, and this again is taking us forward, we're now, if we're going to begin to look at what the resonance of all that is for current politics, all those issues that were raised then were not just about rural countryside, it was about walking and belonging in urban landscapes as well.